In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. I'm going to ask you to, a few things I want to say as we start. I wish I could be a little closer, but we have a cord problem here, so I've got to be loyal to this machinery back here. I came to the Orthodox faith very slowly, like a lot of things. In fact, that's probably the first thing I should say is I ask you to hang with me these first few minutes as I get started. I'm a slow starter, and then if you can do that, if you can persevere, I think we'll really get into this, and it'll come along. I was even almost 10 months in my mother's womb. God bless my mother so I've always been a late starter, and it just seems to keep going. So, it was in the mid-'90s, I was in the middle of a very long Jungian analysis when I became quite intellectually interested in mysticism, which brought me to discovery of Vladimir Lossky and the mystical theology of the Eastern Church. And when I read this book, I thought, this is what I believe. This is everything. But I let it alone. I didn't know, in terms of the Orthodox Church, and all its cultural, manifestations or expressions of faith, how to enter in. And it wasn't until about 3 or 4 years ago when a psychoanalyst colleague of mine, a Greek Orthodox woman, introduced me to the church. We started talking about it, and she walked me in, and that was helpful to have my hand held and brought into the door. So I am a very infant Orthodox Christian. I was fourth generation Episcopalian before that. And I ask you to forgive me if I don't speak accurately about the Orthodox faith. In fact, I really invite you to correct me. I've enjoyed this, being in a faith that I trust, and being a very rebellious kid who never listened to authority. I welcome it now, especially when it has my good in mind. So, the Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained, these are two, you might know, the epic poems of John Milton. I'm not going to cover those in depth, but it's kind of a whole way to look at what I'm going to talk about. I will relate to a little bit of it along the way, and this will come out in a paper where I explore it much more. So let's see. I'll start off with a quote from somebody that most of you know. He's here with us today, about God, psychology, and faith. God and science can only become antagonists when they are seen to be on the same level as competing paradigms, which is an epistemological error. I also think that, and maybe I'll present this to you as a question, I think that psychology and faith should be seen in dialogue. We shouldn't try to psychologize religion, and we shouldn't try to, convert psychology into another religion or something. So with that in mind, what do you think? Do you think we should integrate psychology and faith? Anybody have any thoughts about that? Yes.
Well, I'm a counselor.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Thank you.
I'm a counselor, and what I've seen over the years...
Because we got started earlier with questions, huh?
You did.
Yeah.
You told me. I'm a counselor and have been for a long time, and what I've learned along the way is what works in my line of work is scriptural.
Okay, sure.
And so I don't really have a problem with that. I do have a problem with some of the errors in the profession.
Sure.
that don't line up with that.
Right,
and
right.
that do harm to people.
Right. Okay, thank you. Yeah, and I think this is why it's probably more useful, even though integration is a very attractive term, I think implied with it is watering down things and if we retain what psychology can contribute to the dialogue to faith and what is useful, I began this whole idea of how could psychology be used for faith in terms of thinking of how could psychotherapy aid one's confession? Could it bring confession to a more deeper and authentic level, to where we discuss our vulnerabilities, as was just talked about by Father John Baer. But we have things that are at odds with our faith. Psychology's goals sometimes are self-actualization, all kinds of self-fulfillment, and kind of ego-oriented values. And of course, psychology and faith got off to a very bad start with Sigmund Freud. Here I am, I'm talking about psychoanalysis. I'm not going to be talking about Freudian psychoanalysis. The theories of psychoanalysis evolved far beyond Freud. But Freud, said that religion was a great illusion. He also said something interesting, though. He said that religion was a product of childhood neurosis, which I think is kind of interesting, because if you think of neurosis as ambivalent and unsure, being a child, our child psychology, sometimes these are things that actually we value in our faith. A childlike faith, a dependence upon God, and which is about what I'm going to talk a lot about today. But he was using it, of course, to diminish religion. But so anyway, I hope we can repair some of the damage and have a dialogue between religion and psychology. So I'm going to talk about our defenses today. In fact, I need to go back here and say something. This talk is about our struggle to depend upon God. Even though we have wonderful practices in our faith that lead us through very important sacraments, I'd like to talk about how humans have always wrestled with God and the idea of God, how we have desperately needed Him, and how we have defied Him, and at other times we don't even believe in Him, at least as a human race. Although you learn in the Pilgrim that that's part of the confession sometimes, that God is not believed in. But with all this in mind, there are no atheists in foxholes, and this still seems to be true. And so we always seem to struggle with God in terms of our being the most, being devoted and dependent upon Him. Even St. Peter, who declares Him to be God's Son, later denies Him, not much later. And so we have a lot of conflicts. All right. So in this talk, there's this idea that about from Revelation 3:20, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock." A Protestant idea of that is God is outside and we need to let Him in. We believe much differently as Orthodox that we even carry the icon, we just kind of dim this or we get in the way. And so I'm using door here as a metaphor for our defenses and what we do with that. So I think to resolve some of this idea of is God outside, we invite Him in, or He's inside and we need to acknowledge that. Does anyone recognize this language? This is a Celtic language. And Carl Jung used to have a plaque very much like this in his office. And I can't read it either, but I can tell you what it means. You'll have to trust me that it's what it means. It means bidden or not bidden, God is present. And so it's a very interesting way to think about the paradox of God always being there, and whether we acknowledge it or not, and how we come to terms with it. So, let's see. So, part of the Orthodox Church's response to the fall, you might say, is the whole purpose of the Christian life, theosis. God's grace and love are not limited. It's humans that present our psychology as a potential. and psychology gives us a potential to learn about this barrier. These barriers are the consequences of the fall. Some of you might know Father Vasileios Thermos. It's an idea that he conveyed to me. And one way to think about psychology and faith, the Orthodox faith, is that, let's say theology. Theology is the story of God's creation in all of its perfection, and psychology is the story of human beings after the fall. And so these are, different perspectives, and are important, I think, at least, to bring into dialogue. So psychology has the potential to address the human side of the consequences of the fall. And this is where I'm thinking of confession and repentance, an important bridge here between ourselves and returning to God. Sin as separation, or as we know as missing the mark, also brings some interesting difficulties for Adam and Eve, and some difficulties for us, I would say. The first is separation anxiety. Separation anxiety is the first anxiety humans experience, whether it's leaving the womb, whether it's mother being out of sight. And it's so interesting to think of that as the Garden of Eden. Imagine how much anxiety it might have produced to be kicked out in the story. And so being separated from whom we depend upon creates anxiety. But also, the part of the fall brings this whole idea. Humans, they want to do it on their own. They want to be like God and get into a conflict over it. They want their autonomy, but then we become ambivalent about this dependency. We need God, but we want to do it ourselves. Another consequence of sin is brokenness in relationships. Growing up is imperfect. I want to tell you about some very interesting research. I've been trying to get the reference for it. I've had it for a while, and I almost got it last night. I've been corresponding with another colleague. And the research is this, that in early attachment processes between parent and children, the best optimal parenting, these parents are attuned, emotionally aware of their children about 33% of the time. Okay, sounds like a big failure almost at first glance, right? 33%. Now, that's a very static statement, because relationships are in flux all of the time. And so, truly, if you have good parents, probably you're spending most of the rest of the time trying to get back on track. So this is very much like the spiritual walk, at least the way I think of it, is we kind of drift away from God and we try to come back, the Jesus prayer, and we have different ways of reminding ourselves. So brokenness is a part of growing up, and part of the failures, some of the difficulties we encounter as a very vulnerable young infant, is to experience very difficult anxiety about relying on others, and we begin to form defenses to protect ourselves against depending. So we're going to talk about that in a little while, about what those defenses are. And part of the difficulty we get into, I'm going to go back here to our ambivalence about dependency and independence, is the trying to go it on our own, of course, is a delusion. And the idea of competence versus inadequacy is a false dichotomy. And we learn in psychology, and I think we certainly learned in the last talk, that a healthy dependency produces fruit and life. Okay, I would like to tell a couple of modern stories about the fall. at the age of 4, I read my son a story from one of those animated Bibles. It had all the pictures. It was about the Garden of Eden. And I read him an animated version of Adam and Eve taking from the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil and their subsequent banishment from the Garden of Eden. My son responded rather instantly and emphatically by shouting, "They got to cut down that tree!" There was this instant solution, this kind of omnipotent response, let's just get rid of the problem altogether. Then, I have another story about my son. About 7 or 8 years later, we had from time to time in California, we get flooding, and we had a leak in our ceiling, and I had to patch it up. It was near the chimney, and I had temporarily patched up this hole, and it was still drying with the plaster material. And I turned to my son and said, "Now, do not touch this. I've just repaired it. It needs to dry. Don't tamper with it." Not even an hour later, I walked by. I saw that the patch job had been, poked through, little fingers marks there, and these little fingers had punched through the ceiling. So anyway, there's the I'll do it myself side of a way of looking at the fall. Now, I'd like to go back to this issue of dependency on God. Some developmental experiences that inform dependency. Fairbairn, the English psychoanalyst, actually Scottish, the first anxiety is separation anxiety. We talked about that a little while ago. And this is a very difficult problem because even when we want to go it on our own, you've either done it yourself or you know of someone who ran away from their parents at a very young age, got to the street corner, and they didn't know what they were going to do. They had to come back. This is probably a lot more like us than we realize. And then the next developmental experience I'd like to talk about is breakdown or fear of breakdown. And this is going to require some attention for a while. I'm going to finish these last 2 points, and then we're going to return to fear of breakdown. Breakdown, though, being the kind of the very young agony that is experienced by the human infant in response to the inevitable crises in the mother-infant tie. So breakdown sounds like some kind of clinical reality, like a nervous breakdown or something. Here I'm referring it to as not the 33% part. And this is where if you haven't spent a lot of time with psychoanalytic thought or psychoanalytic psychotherapy, is something I'll ask you to sort of think about in terms of inference. Because psychoanalysis is a metapsychology, we're talking about something that we infer from adult defenses. We don't have a videotape memory of what happened as a child, and it probably wouldn't even help if we could remember exactly what happened. What's more important is the reaction to it, the footprint that has been left on us. And we all have these parts of ourselves when we feel betrayed, or we have certain kinds of closeness and ways that we avoid and have anxieties about things. This is a beginning of talking about what breakdown is. I want to go back to it. There are consequences to the fear of breakdown, and that is unlived parts of ourselves. We actually shut down experience as a way to protect against breakdown. And then finally, self-discovery, sort of this extreme end of psychology. I can do it myself. I don't need God. I don't need others. And, of course, this generates all kinds of problems. So here is what I started to talk about with fear of breakdown. Fear of breakdown is the primitive agony experienced by the helpless infant in response to the inevitable crisis in the fragile mother-infant tie. It's responded to by creating a defensive structure that substitutes a self-created inner reality for external reality, and as a result, foreclosing the real and immediate experiences of important life events. By not experiencing this breakdown, the infant tie, when it occurs during infancy, the individual creates a mental state of living in fear of breakdown that has already happened, but which he did not experience. Now, this is a complicated idea, but what this is saying is that there's a part of our mind that kicks the can down the road in terms of overwhelming anxieties. This is Winnicott's definition, and Winnicott was basically saying that when someone has anxiety today, very often it's a result of the past, and they keep avoiding things that emotionally feel similar, and then they shut down experience. And this is where what's called the false self is formed. The false self is essentially kind of a self-sufficient stance that one takes in which they accommodate the others. Very much like Father John Bear said, the infant doesn't say, I'm fine, mother, you don't need to bother about me. That's the false self. Maybe they don't do it quite as young as his illustration. But false doesn't mean phony. It's a very clever maneuver, and it's a part of what many people in the helping professions adopt. Sometimes one of our best defenses in the caretaking professions is to take care of others. And I don't know if that's a bad thing, but it's something I think it's important to acknowledge and know about ourselves. So it's the reason for the false self is it's too painful to rely upon others. Oh, and I forgot to say one other thing. There are other breakdowns later in life. This isn't all a blame the mother, psychology. We have loved ones who betray us, friends, people who forget us, affairs in marriage, all kinds of, ways that our trust gets broken, as well as other trauma. A later theorist, Thomas Ogden, wrote about the consequences of the fear of breakdown. What he talks about is outlined here, that the child shuts down experience, and this results in a state of mind that does not have a future and does not have a past. Meanwhile, the child, later the adult, mounts up considerable defenses against said breakdown. Now, sometimes it's easy when you read this stuff to say, well, I don't have that, but in a sort of a psychological and relational inventory, when you look at the areas of conflict that you avoid, how a part of you shuts down certain experiences and conversations, you're beginning to move into this part of yourself that forecloses and doesn't live out the fullness of being open to the other. And this can have implications for our relationships with each other and with God. So the unlived life in Ogden's formulation is the fear that parts of ourselves are missing, and we have to find them to become whole. That's his theoretical orientation. We might talk about that much differently if we were talking religiously. Winnicott indicates that the breakdown is defended against by the formation of the false self to protect the real self. So, in favor of the false self, I want to talk about this. We learn to play by the rules. A very well-formed false self will become educated, successful in the world, do all kinds of things because they learn the ropes. But they also learn to do it self-sufficiently for the most part. They might rely on a few along the way, but the adaptation is probably more important than authenticity. And another definition of false self is compliance with the other at the expense of oneself. Just a blind compliance. In his work on trauma, Donald Kalsched talks about the unlived life as a part of the personality that's the innocent child is just hidden away and protected from all the difficulties and vulnerabilities of the world. I think that's why the last talk by Father John Bear is so good, is just coming to terms with our vulnerability and our weakness. It's very difficult to do. But now I'm going to talk about the defenses as they relate to breakdown. Now, we have a very complicated term here that I don't want us to get too wrapped up into, but it keeps it short, and now I'll try to expand it with definition. The paranoid schizoid position. The paranoid schizoid position is this part of the personality that it's, instead of it being a phase of life that one resolves, it's one that a person moves in and out of. The paranoid part of the word is the feelings of persecution that come with relying on someone. This may seem like, well, I don't do that. I have good relationships, but this is the part like you're in a conversation with someone and suddenly things get really serious. Maybe it's politics or some disagreement, and I mean, the levity's gone. The fun, the things become quite serious. That's this kind of way of kind of like getting down in the bunker, hunkering down, and protecting oneself against needing anyone. Schizoid, the schizoid part of this word has to do with withdrawal from others. I don't need you. I don't want to depend on you. Now, paranoid schizoid, this what I just said, like this kind of seriousness and this defiant stance and this I don't need you, this is what I'm thinking about with our faith. We don't always think this, but this is how, if you read Paradise Lost, this is how Satan sounds. He attacks dependency on God repeatedly. And part of what he's also attacking is he's attacking needing God, and he's attacking the loss of God. He's protecting himself from loss. Now, whether Satan really operates this way or not, but this is how he looks like in Milton's version of Paradise Lost. So, the paranoid schizoid position is in my conceptualization here, the master gland of these other defenses. The false self comes out of it because it's a way to manage not needing others. And omnipotent defenses, which sound so grandiose, are, if you think of the obsessive compulsive part of yourself, the part of you that needs to control things. This talk is about our struggle to depend upon God. Even the dependent personality has an omnipotent maneuver, because what they can do is they can shut down real authentic dependency by just giving themselves over to another person. And so it seems like that's dependency, and on one level it is, but there's no real feeling, there's no expression of needs. That gets all shut down. And in the history of many dependent individuals, that's exactly what happened. They were told what to do, things were forced upon them, and they were not able to be authentic with others. So this triad of defenses is something that I argue in my paper about this ongoing process we have of vacillating back and forth between recognition of ultimate dependency on God and others. And as was said yesterday, we need the other or there is no God. If there's no other, God doesn't exist for us, and neither do people, and those get intertwined because if we don't love one another, we don't know God, as John says in the epistle. So, the paranoid schizoid position contains unbearable experiences such as, my loved one has hurt me. And as a result, feelings get split and we withdraw from the feelings of shame that come from painful experiences. To review, the false self is, I will take care of you and accommodate you, and we won't talk about me. Okay, we're not going to go there. And finally, omnipotence is playing God by controlling and shutting down needing others and not depending upon others or God. A little comic relief here for the false self, a collection of assorted fake smiles. I know I've just said false self isn't just being fake, but anyway, that's a little cover up there. And defense mechanisms to keep us from being flexible and open to experience of others. I think my favorite one here is that I used to have superpowers, but my therapist took them away. So, anyway. So this brings us, in my mind at least, to the whole problem of the other. We have defenses against needing others. We don't want to get too close and rely on them. And here we have the beautiful writings of His Eminence John Zizulius, if I'm pronouncing it right, about the I-thou relationship being the fabric of creation. Our need of the other is our affirmation and our problem. Interestingly, even Sartre, who wrote, "The other as my enemy is my original sin." And Emmanuel Levinas says, "I find myself in the other." And finally, I think I just talked about this a little while ago, God is not affirmed without otherness. So we even in our most vulnerable places in relationships, in our minds about opening ourselves to others, we contend with this problem. And I would argue that our dependency on others and our acknowledging it and coming to terms with it is very important to our being authentic and open to God. Okay, back to Paradise Lost, the paranoid schizoid position. I talked about this earlier. Satan is constantly attacking dependency, and it requires hate that kills off love. And we may not think that we do this much, but we might do this more in human relationships than we do when we think about how we talk with God. We may not think, well, I don't, hate God or something, but we need to think about the other also. Also, Satan refuses love to preserve his omnipotent pride and self-love. The loss is eternal for him. It's a permanent fear of breakdown. The can of emotional disaster is kicked down the road permanently. God then becomes the desirable deserter. It's a Harry Gunn trip. And Satan thinks his stance, his never needing God, will keep him from the loss. This is an interpretation I'm bringing you from Paradise Lost, the large epic poem. And then I'd like to add, we often refuse the love and grace of Christ, blocking grace, preferring not to be dependent and staying omnipotent. Language may sound kind of foreign to you, but this is when we go it on our own. This is when we don't rely on God. We just do it ourselves. It's actually much more subtle. All right, so envy is a big part of Satan. Satan wants to have God's power. He wants, to be like God, but he doesn't. Deacon Stephen Muse has talked about wanting what you have, but not who you are. I want to take the creation without the Creator. It's a very beautiful formulation of the fall. And Melanie Klein, who was the psychoanalyst who formulated the paranoid schizoid position, talks about envy as the angry feeling that another possesses and enjoys something else desirable, often accompanied by an impulse to take it away or spoil it. It is destructive, especially of love. Gratitude as an expression of love is the antithesis of envy. And so gratitude itself is an acknowledgement of the other. I'm almost certain that everybody in this room can relate to this idea. You've come to the terms with the idea that sometimes the person that drives you the most crazy has probably been the biggest blessing in your life at a particular time. And so sometimes gratitude can come when we work through a very difficult relational problem. I'm going to just sort of digress briefly about different personality styles with the defenses that we're talking about. The obsessive-compulsive can unconsciously replace divine law with their own and are reluctant to surrender. They want to be in control. and they can't abandon themselves to receive divine mercy. Okay, big struggle. These aren't things to pathologize. These are things to make, if this is something we'd struggle with, that's part of our work. This is part of our resolving our ambivalence towards God and others. The paranoid may have no alternative to cope with the trauma of prohibitions, guilt and shame, except through inventing and projecting an enemy. It's too painful to acknowledge what's inside. The narcissist is tempted through their fear of not being special, and the fear is that they won't be loved. We don't always see that because they can seem, especially if it's the type that everybody can diagnose. I'm not going to mention anybody. I know we have graphic examples these days. But truly fear that they will not be loved if they're not special. And then the dependent, I think we talked about this, eliminating anxieties by appeasing and omnipotently controlling the other through their dependency. Deny all feelings and needs. Okay. A little message from the poets of the 70s. Interestingly, pretzel logic. Pretzel logic feels good to think about human defenses. I think it's the song Pretzel Logic. I've never met Napoleon, but I plan to find the time because he looks so fine upon that hill. They tell me he's lonely still. A difficult problem with omnipotence. King of the world or on top of the world for a little while, and there's who's there with you. And another set of poetry from Pink Floyd, the longing for connection, but just running around in circles, repeating the same problems, the same old fears. And so it's kind of a despairing kind of, problem. And that is, I think I bring this up because it's not something to say, well, these other people do it. Sometimes we find we do repeat the same defensive patterns. And so this is what I want to make you aware of, is it's not what other people do, it's the little loops that we get caught into and repeat for ourselves. Okay, well, there is an answer. Paradise Regained, another follow-up, 2.0 or something like this from John Milton. Melanie Klein talked about how the destructiveness of our envy and our paranoid stances, our schizoid stances, is transformed into connection by gestures of reparation. We begin to realize we need the other. We begin to realize that emotionally, if we don't feel emotionally connected, it's draining. It's depleting. And so surviving destructiveness and in between ourselves and someone else, if you've ever had a conflict where you were afraid that maybe it was the end of the relationship and you survive it, it's not the imperfection of the relationship that's the problem. The problem is not being able to survive it. If we can survive breaches in a parent-child relationship, something that happened between ourselves and our parents, or all different levels of relationships, if we can survive it, love can grow from it. If we develop our capacity to feel guilt and grieve, to feel the painful feelings of disconnection, we begin to develop more of our own self inside. And I'm not talking about gratification or self-actualization. We start to feel a separateness that acknowledges the other. It's the part that Levinas is talking about, and the part of that Zizioulas is talking about as well. And also, we learn this very beautiful gift in relationships, the gift of tears, which is, I think we all know, is a gift of the Holy Spirit. And I think I haven't highlighted that yet, but I really want to say that I don't really want to separate that part of psychology and theology or faith from each other, that the Holy Spirit is very important in all of this. Okay, further gestures of repair repairing relationship. Hunger. The more we go without the nurturance that comes from defending ourselves against others and God, the more depleted we feel. And so repair becomes a necessity. It's interesting because in Paradise Regained, Milton uses Satan's trying to tempt Christ through physical hunger in the desert. And so, Christ responds, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall never hunger. I think if I'm not mixing up the narrative. But nevertheless, we are fed by Christ. And this concept of asceticism and practice of asceticism is extremely important to, as we know, to sort out the essential from the non-essential. A prerequisite is we have to renounce our omnipotence. We cannot control the other. And this opens up space for connection. Consciousness is born by empathy for the other and opening up space for the self. And so this is where I think psychology is important, when it humbles us, when it helps us, feel vulnerability. And in a sense, when I started this project, my idea was psychotherapy is a handmaiden to confession, when it can serve confession, repentance, and bring us back to God. And therapy is not a substitute for confession. I think it should hopefully set the table for confession. This I didn't write this slide a few minutes ago in Father John Bair's talk, but I had read this in Becoming Human, that we know that experientially what it is to be weak. If we are to know the strength of God, we have to know what it is to be weak. And I'm curious to find out from you, Father John, where the translation is, your apostasy shall teach you. I looked it up and I couldn't find this translation. I love that translation. Okay, yes. Yeah. Okay, yeah, very good. So we know death in our separation, and we come to life only known in God. So by relinquishing our self-sufficient withdrawal, you can see this is the part of psychology we're suspicious of, and we probably should be. Self-sufficiency, self-actualization is really not a religious idea. But we can know our weakness, and through the lowering of our defenses, transform our mortal selves to our mortality and the corruptible to incorruption. These are all from Becoming Human. Great. It's a very wonderful, reflective work. And restoration to God is more authentic. I was talking to Father Seraphim here before. Confession can deepen, potentially, through knowing ourselves more humbly. So, restoration to God. Okay. I'll try to finish up here soon. We have till when? 10 till? Okay. I'll try to finish up quickly. From Zizulius, in a culture elevating the individual, we protect ourselves from the other. The other is an adversary, a potential adversary. Our rights of the individual feel threatened by our needs of others, but we run the risk of becoming a paranoid, schizoid culture. Zizulius says, alienation from the other is another result of the fall. And this is what I'm really trying to talk about, is not only this result of it, but our struggle to depend upon the other and come to terms with the other. And then I already but we accept only others like us. This is a big problem. We love it when people agree with us. Hell is isolation from others. And I already did this other Sartre quote earlier. The cure, like reparation, is metanoia, repentance. We all share in the fall, its consequences, not its guilt. And We need to feel sorry for our ability to commune with God. Otherness is both the cure and is ontological. God is not affirmed without otherness. And personhood is the experience of the cross and is freedom and creativity. We also sacrifice because we need each other and we need God. So the defense mechanisms in psychoanalytic theory are an operation of the ego, and so our defenses and the ego, to some extent, need to be sacrificed in order to open the door to others and to God. We have to choose to work through our barriers to otherness, to embrace God's great love and grace, or choose to remain in despair. Oh, I'm not going to, don't try to read this, but this is a list of 10 different personality styles and these false self, paranoid, schizoid, and omnipotent defenses that I'm going to expand upon in hopefully my book. So if you want a copy of that or something, you can let me know. But I just wanted to show you I've kind of worked with this some. And I think I won't talk about, read this to you, but I hope that I've communicated some of the theology of communion and otherness, some of the problems that relationships and relationships with God bring for us and how we contend with them, but how our coming to terms with them and how we need each other and need God at a much deeper level can be very helpful in having a more authentic and deeper life in God, in His presence. All right, thank you. Yes. So the devil's advocate again?
Yeah, I guess not. First, I want to thank you for bringing this up. It's very a deep question that I think you're asking, and I feel that there is an inherent tension in the psychological field regarding the issue of envy, which I think it's at the core of what you're discussing. So I think it's important to make a bit of a distinction there. Part of what you presented, especially the schizoid paranoid position, it was elaborated by Melanie Klein. And that happens in the wake of the First World War, first by Freud and then by Klein, by trying to understand how was it possible that atrocity that nobody could, I guess, imagine or even accept. So the explanation was there is something bad inside, morbid, and Freud came with the death instinct, and then Melanie Klein developed the death instinct, and in a way that is considered to be primordial, to be inherent in us. We have a life instinct, but we have a death instinct as well. This is a dual ontology. We're going back to Jung in that respect. And then the Kleinian babies have this, right, envy in them, which is a correlate of anger, of rage. Yes. And the schizoid paranoid position is this created in order, because there is love for the mother and there is hate, rage for the mother, and then it's split.
Keep the unbearable feelings apart. Yes.
And then the anger is not held in, where it's too poisonous to be held in. It kills love, but it's projected onto the other. So I'm not angry at my mother. My mother are not hating her.
Correct.
She's hating me.
Yes.
By extension, The devil can say, I'm
she's
not
she's
hating
withholding from me, is the projection.
But that's because she's withholding, right?
Yes, yes.
But later on came Bowlby, and he was a psychoanalyst who came with a different idea, and it was not well received in the attachment theory, where envy here and the anger is seen more a derivative, is a consequence of deprivation, is not something inherent in the baby. The baby will become angry if there is too much failure,
right?
More than that 33% match, right?
Right.
So, and then we learn how to defensively exclude our parts of ourselves that could not be met by the caregiver, right?
Yes.
And then we become to shun off and create the false self to actually preserve the relationship. Not necessarily to defend against the dependency, but to save
You're absolutely
dependency.
right. It is to preserve the relationship.
Because it is conditional. That's no longer unconditional. I cannot be accepted with everything I have. I have to exclude some. And I think from this distinction between two views of what's happening when it comes about envy and anger and hate, either it's primarily inside or it's coming from an experience, a failure, in the attachment.
Yes.
And I'm not saying that it's either or.
No, my next chapter in the book is it's a whole review of attachment theory.
So then we have to give up our defenses. The question is, okay, if it is our own doing, then we have to do it. But if it's not quite our own doing, if it's from the beginning, it depended on the other to help us deal with that,
Absolutely.
then it depends on other to begin with. It depends on a fortunate encounter and trust. And I wonder if you can comment on this. I stop here.
I hope that, yes. So the next chapter I review attachment, and what attachment theory brings us to is the idea that corresponds with paranoid schizoid position. It's called embeddedness. And this is the stance that we take against the other in relationship. And also, it sounds like you've read Melanie Klein. The idea is to move towards this sort of sad-sounding depressive position. But what's so beautiful about the depressive position is the acknowledgement of need of others and gratitude and a sort of spirit of compromise in relationship. It isn't always concretely possible in every relationship because you need the other to sort of somehow cooperate in the dialogue, even if they can't say exactly what you'd like. You need some kind of engagement. But it is something we come to terms with in ourselves. And insight and more awareness of self come through this because we're not the entitled, grandiose person who everybody has victimized now. We see the imperfection in things. We acknowledge the shortcomings in humans after the fall, if we were to say it theologically. But so is this getting at, more towards what you're...
Right. We recognize that, and then I think it's important, but how do we come to recognize it? If it's something that comes from inside,
right,
or if it's something that comes from outside.
Right. Well,
from others.
yeah. How does it get there? Yes, that's right. It takes a lot of work. This is what people do in therapy, or in it could be a relationship with a very helpful father, but somehow we need the experience of another to help see this. Look, see how you just did that. I've had patients. They say, they'll even say that I left them when they were the ones who went on vacation, and so. But I mean, that's a very simplistic example. But nevertheless, this is how we distort things. And a few more minutes to do one more question. But I want to say the dissatisfying thing is that we become aware that through life we really vacillate back and forth between paranoid schizoid and depression. It's not the depressive position. And so we think it's not a stage that you resolve. The primitive level gets resolved, but we still, dig in relationships. We get, we roll up our sleeves and now we're in conflict again, or we're angry and projecting all over again. We get briefly paranoid and withdraw, and then we're able to see how we did that and so we go back and forth. I kind of see our spiritual walk like this, self-sufficiency, and then wait, whoop, I need God here. What am I doing? I'm out on my own here. Like the separation anxiety persists throughout life. Okay. Any other questions? We probably have time for, can we briefly do one more? Yeah? Okay. Yes. Are you all right with... Sure. Thank you.
So, hi. Thank you for
Hello.
Thank you for your presentation. It was really interesting.
Thank you.
I'd like to hear you elaborate more on this idea of gratitude.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a couple other things, but I know we're short on time. This idea of gratitude in the sense of the religiosity meeting psychotherapy, the Eucharist, Evchariston, to give thanks. The Eucharist is communion, right? And you're talking about this relationality, the idea of gratitude bringing us to the other. When we give gratitude, when we say thanks, give real thanks, right? We're overcoming a part of ourselves. So we're making ourselves vulnerable in that sense. So maybe this idea of gratitude as a connect between the psychotherapeutic and the
I will try.
Okay.
Especially the weaker link is definitely theologically for me, but I will try. I think that there is a psychological dimension, or we could think about it this way, that is just as important theologically when we ingest the bread and the wine, taking Christ in, and that this is a very important part, and we've prepared for it, hopefully, in an authentic way. We've gone to confession, and we're in a process of repentance, and we've opened ourselves up for relationship to God. We've restored we've confessed because there's blockage, so we've missed the mark, and we're restoring our relationship to God. We're grateful that we have Him. And so I think there's a lot to this. And when, from a psychoanalytic perspective, eating disorders are taking in what's the nurturance, but not being able to hold it down, or not being able to take it in at all. And so you might even think of it as like a spiritual anorexia. I can't take God and His nurturance in because I have these defenses, and I'm afraid, huge ambivalence and anxiety. And so, like either with anorexia, we can't take it in at all, or spiritual bulimia would be to just we kind of only take it in for a while and we reject it. So I think there's so much more to say theologically about this, but that's right, because Eucharist is thanksgiving. It means literally, isn't it? Translated thanksgiving. So. Okay, well, all right, thank you very much.